Golden Doves, class 186 or 187, whatever the title says. We're on page 107 on the bottom of the page. We're dealing with the difference between written and oral text, and we were dealing with Megillat Esther in particular, right, and how there could be derasha at the orthographic level of the text, right, like kibel versus kibelu. So for Shemuel, who says that Megillat Esther nitina likrot v'lo nitina likatev, it means there is no orthographic level of the text, and therefore there's no derasha on the missing vav, right? You read it kibelu, but it says kibel. According to Rav, who says no, that Megillat Esther is a full book, and therefore nitina likatev also, you can make derasha on the written text, on letters at the orthographic level. Okay. In conclusion, written rather than actual writing. You see, not everything that's physically written is considered Torah shebichtav, right? Expresses a legal status. To begin with, it involves an element of intentionality, whether or not the text was consigned for writing. So when you wrote the Sefer Torah, you're writing it as a written text, and when, let's say, Yirmiyahu Hanavi wrote the book of Yirmiyahu, let's say, he wrote it for the specific purpose of having it being included with the written documents, with the written texts, with the written books of Israel. Once a formal pronouncement was made with the purpose of being legally registered, the text acquires the status of being written, regardless of whether the document was actually written, right? So once we decide that the words of Yirmiyahu Hanavi was giving us the Nebuot for many, many years, and these words are going to be part of the written text of Israel. It doesn't matter whether the words were actually written at this point. It can then be quoted in court, interpreted, analyzed, and implemented. It could then be quoted in court, right? Because it's a written document, right? So it has interpreted, and now the Bet Din can interpret it. This is in the case, of course, of a shetab that's written, because you could have a milva al peh, you could have a milva dichtav, right? Right. So this is at the legal level of written texts, right, as opposed to books of Israel, right? Analyzed and implemented by the proper authorities. So they say, okay, Reuven must pay Shimon $100. We have the written text, and we see what it says. Conversely, a certain class of statements which law considers as not to be consigned for writing will retain the status of oral, although the actual document was registered to this effect, right? Sometimes you can have something that has the status of an oral text, even though it's actually written. So you can have, for example, the words of a Shechim Merah, Kichtuvi Mechimsulim Damu. Now, even though it's an oral text, that has the status of a written text. And then you can have things written down which actually have the status of oral. And I believe my father will bring some examples of that later. Okay. The distinction of written and oral law follows similar lines. So now we know in Jewish jurisprudence, there's a distinction between a written statement and an oral statement. And the distinction is not necessarily whether it was actually written down, right? But I want to correct what I said at the beginning of this particular class. It wasn't talking about the books of Israel. I mischaracterized. I misinterpreted what my father was writing here. He was talking about documents submitted to the court, right? And the legal status of that document. If it's written, it's one law. If it's oral, it's another law. So, for example, if it's a written document, you can mosi'in yad al hakochot. You can use it to seize property that was sold by the debtor to a third party, as an example, right? So I just wanted to correct that. I was not talking about Yirmiyah. That was a misstatement on my part. It's talking about when the court decides to accept a document as a written document, and then it can be subject to interpretation, and then there are certain consequences, legal consequences, to treating it as a written as opposed to oral. Right. So the distinction between written and oral law follows similar lines. The scriptures were consigned to be written, nitina likatev, as a duly registered document which is committed, misar, to the court. The scriptures have a Masorah that is a registered orthographic text, right? That's why you can make derashot on the letters of the Torah. When put into writing, the canon scrolls are subject to ritual laws such as the defilement of the hands. If it's a Sefer Torah, it's metameh hayadayim. And the requirement of a handkerchief for handling, so you need to have a mitpahat. Lines, shirtut, must be marked on the parchment to indicate the divine trace. That is, that the text was pronounced with or by the Holy Spirit. So the lines that you put shirtut, it represents the Ruach HaKodesh through which, or the Nevuah, through which the text was written, or given to the person who wrote it, the Navi who received it. Therefore, unlike unwritten texts, the writing contained in canon scrolls is consigned to be expounded. Then you nitanali hidaresh, and because of that, you can make derasha on it. Authoritative teaching could be expressed by applying canonical exegesis to the text. Right, and if you have a halacha, an authoritative halacha, you can connect the authoritative halacha to the text because nitanali daresh. So again, I have a halacha, and this halacha doesn't have an explicit source in the Torah, but I use a derasha to connect the halacha with the source in the Torah, or with the pasuk in the Torah through derasha. Since this class of writing has a Masorah text, canonical exegesis applies to both the verbal and orthographic levels of the text, right? So I can make derasha on the letters, right? Right. Not just on the words. Exegesis could be applied to the letters, fragments, and words of text. I don't know what he meant by fragments. Maybe he was referring there to the crowns, to the ketarim. Parts of words. I think that's what he means. Yeah, parts of words. Letters and fragments, parts of words. Yeah. Yiger Shiragon brings that. And words of the text, regardless of the lexical sense, it doesn't mean ketarim, it means parts of words. This is why a written text cannot be orally transmitted authoritatively, right? You have to write it down to transmit it. Oral transmission excludes the possibility of textual exegesis. This point was expressed tersely by the Bishem Sidio, commenting on the reason why written words are not to be transmitted orally. He wrote, the reason for this is that in a written composition, many things are expounded on the basis of the orthographic text. For example, defective or full spelling, haser or maleh, yod or vav, or no yod or vav. The oral version, in contradistinction to the written version, right? Yes. If oral transmission was authorized, this would have to be excluded, right? The only way you can have derasha is if you have actual written text, right? And that's why it has to be transmitted through writing. Let's see if the footnote, Kelalesh Shemuel.